Hi, I am Dr. Clarence R. Pearson Sr., and welcome to My View, a podcast where I offer my professional perspective on today's most pressing geopolitical and socioeconomic issues. Recently, my attention has been drawn to developments in the Middle East. US President Donald Trump is faced with what might end up becoming the worst nightmare of the presidency, as he is entangled in a conflict that proves to be beyond a deal, even for the one considered a master deal broker. Here is my view on the matter. The Ali problem, why the US Iran crisis is now also a US Israel crisis. For 3 months, President Donald Trump has tried to sell the war with Iran as a conflict moving toward resolution. A ceasefire was always near, a deal was always possible. The Strait of Hormuz, the narrow artery through which much of the world's oil trade flows, was always on the verge of reopening. But the crisis has exposed a harder reality. Washington is not negotiating with one problem, it is negotiating with three. There is Iran, weakened but unwilling to surrender its nuclear sovereignty or maritime leverage. There is Israel, militarily dominant but increasingly willing to act on timelines that collide with American diplomacy. And there is the United States itself, where rising fuel prices, inflation, congressional pressure, and election year anxiety have turned a foreign policy gamble into a domestic political threat. The result is a strategic disconnect at the center of the Middle East crisis. Washington wants a deal. Tehran wants survival without humiliation. Jerusalem wants freedom of military action. These goals may overlap in speeches, but they collide on the ground. The first obstacle is Iran's refusal to accept the terms Washington considers essential. The Trump administration wants the removal or neutralization of Iran's highly enriched uranium stockpile, tighter limits on enrichment, and a monitored reopening of the Strait of Hormuz. Iran sees those demands not as technical safeguards, but as surrender of nuclear dignity, surrender of territorial leverage, and surrender of the asymmetric tools that allow it to challenge a stronger adversary. That is why ceasefires keep failing. They are pauses in violence, not settlements of the dispute. The Iran can stop firing for a few days while refusing to disarm. The United States can suspend escalation while refusing to lift pressure. Each side calls the pause proof of strength. Neither side is willing to call it compromise. The Strait of Hormuz has become the physical symbol of this impasse. For Washington, reopening the waterway is essential to stabilizing oil markets and lowering pressure on American consumers. For Tehran, the strait is one of the few instruments that can force the world to take its demands seriously. Giving it up without sanctions relief would be, in Iranian political terms, capitulation. The second obstacle is Lebanon. Iran has made clear that it will not separate the US Iran track from Israel's war against Hezbollah. When Israeli strikes intensify in Lebanon, Tehran treats them as evidence that Washington either cannot restrain Israel or does not intend to. That linkage has repeatedly disrupted talks. This is where the crisis becomes more complicated for Trump. Iran is an adversary, but a predictable one. It bargains hard, threatens escalation, and seeks concessions. Israel is an ally, but under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, it has become, from Washington's perspective, harder to manage. Recent reports of Trump's anger at Netanyahu point to a deeper fracture. The issue is not merely tone, it is strategy. Trump wants a deal that can reopen Hormuz, reduce gasoline prices, and allow him to claim a historic diplomatic victory. Netanyahu's military actions in Lebanon, however, risk widening the conflict at the very moment Washington is trying to narrow it. That is why the reported confrontation between the two leaders matters. It shows that the old assumption that US and Israeli objectives automatically move together no longer fully holds. Israel may see continued strikes in Lebanon as necessary to weaken Hezbollah and deter Iran. Trump may see the same strikes as an obstacle to ending a war that is hurting him politically at home. The political asymmetry is striking. For Trump, the war's costs are immediate and measurable. Oil prices rise, gasoline prices follow, inflation remains stubborn, Congress grows restless. Voters do not experience the war as a strategic chessboard, they experience it at the pump in grocery bills and in household budgets. The House War Powers vote was a warning that even a president's own party cannot ignore public fatigue forever. For Netanyahu, the danger is also severe but different. His governing coalition is fragile, and Israel faces deep political exhaustion. Yet war can still be used to frame him as indispensable. The leader who understands Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the existential threats facing Israel. A prolonged crisis may damage Israel's global standing, but it can also give Netanyahu a campaign argument. Trump needs closure. Netanyahu may benefit from continuation. That is the central tension. The United States is therefore caught between two conflicting pressures: restrain Iran without rewarding it, and restrain Israel without appearing to abandon it. That is a narrow diplomatic path, and every missile strike, tanker seizure, or air raid makes it narrower. The crisis also reveals the limits of military pressure as diplomacy. Bombing can degrade capacity, blockades can impose pain, sanctions can worsen inflation, but none of these tools automatically produces political surrender. Iran's leaders may be under pressure, but they still must sell any agreement to hardliners who will denounce concessions as betrayal. Netanyahu may be isolated abroad, but he must answer to domestic constituencies that view restraint as weakness. Trump may want peace, but he has built a political brand around dominance, making compromise harder to explain. A durable settlement would require more than another ceasefire announcement. It would require a connected framework: nuclear limits tied to sanctions relief, maritime guarantees tied to Iranian security assurances, Lebanon stabilization tied to Hezbollah withdrawal, and Gaza de escalation tied to humanitarian access and post war governance. Without that broader architecture, every ceasefire will remain vulnerable to the next front. The lesson for policymakers is simple but uncomfortable. There is no separate US Iran deal if Lebanon burns, no stable Lebanon settlement if Israel and Hezbollah remain outside the enforcement structure, and no relief for American consumers if Hormuz remains a bargaining chip. The Middle East crisis of 2026 is not only a test of American power, it is a test of American coordination with adversaries, with allies, and with its own domestic politics. So far, the disconnect is winning. My View is a continuing series where I share informed commentary on a wide range of geopolitical and socioeconomic topics. If you found today's discussion helpful, please follow, subscribe, like, and share. Thank you for spending this time with me, and I invite you to explore other My View episodes available online. Until we meet again, goodbye.